America is in the game and America is going to win, so said Donald Trump in a major policy announcement on national security. But by singling out Russia and China, how will these plans for US national security affect its international standing? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. We know it is all about America first, but Donald Trump's latest announcement on national security has showed he still has a wary eye on the international stage, most notably China and Russia. Yes, Iran and North Korea are still seen as threats, but China and Russia, Trump says they are competition. This was all part of the unveiling of Trump's national security strategy in a speech in Washington on Monday. In it, he criticized past administrations for not looking out for the interests of American citizens and made it clear that his way forward would involve competing with other countries rather than cooperating with them as much. In the president's own words, quote, "We will stand up for ourselves and we will stand up for our country like we have never stood up before." But in putting America first, other countries were also put on notice. Here is Donald Trump on China and Russia.
We will attempt to build a great partnership with those and other countries, but in a manner that always protects our national interest. But while we seek such opportunities of cooperation, we will stand up for ourselves and we will stand up for our country like we have never stood up before.
We are all willing to work with the US to build a strong, stable and sound bilateral economic relationship. It is in line with the two countries' interests and the expectation of the international community.
And with that, here is the panel for today, starting in London with Indrajit Parmar, who is the chairman of the Obama Research Network and a professor of international relations at City University in London. In Birmingham, Scott Lucas, a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham. And in Lubbock, Texas, Oliver McGee, a professor at Texas Tech University, a former assistant secretary for transportation. Gentlemen, we welcome all three of you to Inside Story. And what I sometimes like to do on this program is start with one question to all of you and just get a quick fire response from each of you. So that question basically is, was there anything notably different in this speech, given that it was a policy speech, it was a strategy speech, or was it a continuation of the campaign rhetoric? Indrajit, we'll start with you.
I think there's a definite whiff of the campaign rhetoric, but there's also in the strategy itself quite clear commitment to a kind of US global leadership, and it's looking for threats and enemies, and I think it's identified what you said, Russia and China and others as well, and I think that suggests that there's going to be a ramping up of hard American power as opposed to any kind of soft power. So the use of corporate economic power to get what America wants transactionally, as well as the use of military power and the beefing up of military forces. That, I think, is the biggest takeaway as far as I can see, particularly from the National Security Strategy document itself. Okay,
all points will come back to you shortly. Scott Lucas, your early thoughts?
Nothing new in the document itself. We've been here before in terms of confronting strategic competitors like China and Russia. For example, in the George W. Bush administration before 9/11, what was new is the man delivering it, his tone. We've got a bit of schizophrenia here, that Donald Trump actually believes that Vladimir Putin of Russia is his very good friend, wants to rely on Russia, and that is very much at odds with a document that he probably hasn't read, but was presenting yesterday.
And Oliver McGee, your thoughts?
This is about the Russian-China games, akin to Nixon's China games. I think he's talking about the topic of speed for technology and science and technology to match the speed of the growing economy. At $6 trillion of wealth, plus $4 trillion he's going to repatriate back on shore in the United States, making about a $10 million wealth enterprise, and he's saying that economic security of the United States is global security for the nation states around the world.
Oliver, I'll stay with you now that we've gotten thoughts from all three of you and just start to pick out some of the things which Donald Trump said in his speech. I noticed he said, quote, "We are engaged in a new era of competition." And this was the word he used, particularly with China and Russia, was to define it that it wasn't saying they're enemies as such, but they are our competition. What's new about this era of competition that wasn't a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
China has been basically involved in a global competition of growth, very, very large growth. And the United States has decided to get into that game very, very aggressively. We're right now sitting at about 3.3% growth, and he's going to push this economy after he passes his tax reform within today or tomorrow into a 4%, 5% growth model. That puts him at the top 3 modern presidencies in growth since Truman. And this economy hasn't seen anything like that before. What we're going to be seeing is a rapid fire of building the domestic enterprise with homeland security, with infrastructure development inside America. And then once we build the crumbling infrastructure, a strong America is a secure America, but also a strong America is a more secure world. And that's really what he's saying in the behind the words and the strategy inside his speech on Monday.
Is it not a bit isolationist, though, Oliver? And that's something we're going to address more later, but still.
Trump is coming at you in the spirit of cooperation, both cooperation and competition. And that's a very, very hyper-competitive, market-driven type of approach to national security. He says that if we have the wealth, then we can afford to be able to do regional type of national security, not nation building, nation state building, but looking at controlling and at the same time in securing the peace in regions. He's also looking at a growing Korea, which is beginning to get into the nuclear game, and he needs to control that between China and Russia. So that's very, very important for him to do that. And that's going to cost money to the United States. The United States is not going to be the indispensable nation as Madeleine Albright presented. It's going to be a nation that is looking at regional strategies for its national and international security, driven by a very, very strong economic currency, not only on the dollar, not only in the 24,000 plus market, going to 25,000 by the end of this year, but also looking at new networks types of currencies in the Bitcoin market, which is now pushing beyond 20,000. We're changing how we do money, but we're also changing how we do the guns. Because ultimately, President Trump is the national security instrument, and it's about the guns and the money.
Okay, Scott, let's bring you back in. Oliver's laid out an argument there. He used an interesting word there, co-opetition, I think it was. Is it more one or the other? What do you make of that argument?
Well, again, if you cut through Oliver's campaign rhetoric, he proves my point. Cooperative competition was the exact phrase used by Condoleezza Rice back in 2000, 2001. This idea that in a post-Cold War world, we weren't necessarily, always enemies of the Russians or the Chinese, but we were going to be competing with them. So there's nothing new there. What is different is what Oliver has done is he's presented a campaign speech, which is more about the U.S. economy. And that's the idea of, oh, Donald Trump is the one who's going to preside over unparalleled economic growth. The stock market's going to be wonderful. We're going to have fantastic growth. He's going to rescue infrastructure, rescue jobs. Look, we can use another program to talk about why a lot of that is smoke and mirrors. But that's exactly what Trump is playing with. He's not as concerned, ironically, in this speech as much about the details of national security. The idea is, amidst the Trump-Russia investigation, guys, stick with me. Stick with the tax cuts, even if they benefit the wealthiest of Americans, because this will make America great again.
Oliver, I'll let you reply in a moment. I just don't want to forget about Inderjeet at this stage, who we haven't heard from. Just another quote from President Trump's speech referring to China, saying that China seeks to challenge American influence, values and wealth. I mean, that in itself is not actually that surprising. And further to that, if there is a challenge, why run from it? I'm not saying Donald Trump is running from it, but why not meet it rather than retreat?
Well, I don't think that Donald Trump, the administration, is retreating at all. There's nothing isolationist about the national security strategy. In fact, it's a very kind of powerful thrust to continue a kind of broad post-war, post-Cold War strategy overall. That is a global regional strategy. I think the key thing is that there seem to be two forces working within the national security strategy. One is the old campaign rhetoric of Make America Great Again, America First, and about anti-immigration and so on. But the second one is, I think, appears to be authored by somebody like General McMaster, which is basically the old strategy that conservative nationalists have championed for a long time. And that is the use of American strength in order to sort of maintain their vital interests. And clearly, China has been a competitor for some time. There's also been a lot of cooperation with the United States for a long time. I think the feeling is that Trump is trying to differentiate himself very significantly from his predecessors, and the campaign style of the national security strategy suggests that. But the underlying basic points being made, and the only thing which is really different, you could say, is there's no mention of soft power, very large amounts of hard power. And I think that, even if there's not much new there, it's a little bit more kind of open than it has been in the past. And I think that it could well be much more risky in regard to risking military confrontations more frequently. He's not isolationist. He said in the strategy that NATO is very important for maintaining, kind of close control of Russia. The EU now suddenly is very important as well. And he mentions his friends and allies of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India now, and the whole of the Pacific area is called the Indo-Pacific, not Asia-Pacific anymore. So there's nothing isolationist. I think he's basically continuing the old American policy of
Let me jump in,
China.
Indrajit. Let me jump in, because you've said many times there that he is not isolationist. I want to put that argument to the test, because many would believe that Donald Trump has isolated the US since he's come to office. I want to list off a few examples. These are admittedly not the document that we're talking about, but more widely, you go back to the beginning of the year, he pulled out of the 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership because he said he wanted to, quote, protect American jobs. On climate change, which the Obama administration considered one of the main dangers facing the US, Donald Trump dropped it from the list of global threats. He announced the US would pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. Syria, yes, there was the one airstrike on a government airbase, but the United States has largely stayed out of the conflict, and it was a gap which Russia was happy to fill there. And most recently, of course, Donald Trump's order to move the US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, condemned right around the world. Indrajit, I will stay with you and then come back to the others. That sounds like isolation. Now, I know you're pointing out that you feel the document doesn't, but widely, this is something which this is a road that he is taking the United States down.
I think what you can say is that he's got a more nuanced attitude towards the international system because of the hardcore, what he calls America's national or vital interests. So the climate change violates another key interest he considers to be vital, which is corporate interests. He has released and deregulated big corporations, and climate change and those kind of regulations around the environment were a key restraint as far as he could see. So he's gone out of that, and of course he's pulled out of UNESCO as well. But if you look at the hardcore kind of military alliances, he's now rediscovered that they are very, very important. So in that sort of the key infrastructure of the post-war order, he's not really fundamentally challenging it. What he's saying is he wants to bend those institutions to America's will much more than they have been. And that doesn't seem any different to me from President Obama or President Bush or President Clinton or any other presidents before those. They try to bend the international system to their will, and they go unilateral where they can't get it necessarily to their will. I think President Trump is effectively continuing that.
Oliver, is that what he's doing?
As the sovereign in the United States, he's really looking to balance efficiency with dignity. Dignity in how the United States defines itself as a regional power in the face of looking at China as a strong regional power and Russia as a regional power. And when you look at this troika, they have to compete in a very, very fastest game. The economics is getting faster. The advancements in science and technology is getting even faster. We're looking at a quantum speed economy that has to match quantum physics and quantum thinking in its technology. And that is the quantum size of the supply side that he's approaching in the guns of the money. This particular strategy is very, very innovative. It is not a campaign speech because he's really trying to link economic security with national security, and he's also looking at homeland security so that he can secure the nation borders as the sovereign in the United States. And he's sending that message across Europe to the Queen, to the European nations, that you have to secure your borders in order to secure your nation. This is what Brexit was all about. And all we're looking at right now is Brexit in America. And this is exactly the way the future of foreign policy at this particular era is moving forward. It's about dignity and efficiency. And that is what I mean by the cooperation. A cooperation and a global competition to compete in a very, very fast international market as the currencies are changing. We're no longer in centralized central banking and ledgers. We're now in network banking, distributed to decentralized currencies. And this is basically changing how we do the guns and the money. And that's what that national security strategy yesterday was all about.
Okay, borders, going to come back to that later on. I do want to just pause for a second and think about Russia. We've talked about China already. The Kremlin has responded to the new national security policy, saying it cannot accept that it is treated as a threat. This was from spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said, quote, "The imperialist character of this document is obvious, as is the refusal to renounce a unipolar world, an insistent unwillingness, disregard for a multipolar world. We cannot agree with an attitude that sees our country as a threat to the United States." Scott Lucas, I think it was you who said this earlier, said that Donald Trump is under a misconception, I think it was, that he is, that President Trump is his friend. And yet there's a statement like that as well. Frenemies? Is this where we are with Russia?
No, where Russia is they're trying to exploit that schizophrenia that I talked about between the document and Donald Trump personally. And that is the document, and Inderjeet's quite right here, is trying to return to that idea of trying to confront Russia, not only politically, militarily, economically, but in the cyberspace of the 21st century. It even talks about Russia intervening in the 2016 election, which of course they did. Donald Trump, however, and he said this again yesterday, considers Vladimir Putin to be a friend. Twice in the past week, the Kremlin and the White House have put out phone calls about Putin and Trump cooperating with each other. So what the Kremlin's trying to do is say, no, 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 no. Donald, we're working with you. We know that you're innocent of any type of collusion with us last year. Don't worry about your national security advisors who may want to take a harder line. You just keep counting on us as your buddy. That's the way they'll try to play this in the next day or two. And we have to see where this goes. Because again, I repeat to you, Trump didn't read this document. For whatever, Oliver's given it a gloss, but Trump just simply wanted to say, make America great again. I'm great for the economy. He doesn't know the details. The Chinese will do the same thing, by the way. They'll try to exploit a difference between Trump and his advisors to try to work America. We're going to see, in other words, a lot of maneuvering around this document in the next week or two.
So who do we listen to then, Scott, on the Russia issue, at least from the US side? I think I've actually discussed this with you in a previous interview on Al Jazeera News, the idea of what Trump says versus what, quote unquote, the administration says or the other people around him or the document says. What's going to be the official line on Russia then?
Almost every country, every embassy, every foreign office in the world will be asking that same question, Kamal, and trying to get an answer. And that is, if you talk not just about Russia, but about China or about NATO or the Middle East, do you rely on Trump or his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, or other White House advisors, or do you rely on the Pentagon and the State Department? The fact is right now is that the State Department, the Pentagon, National Security Council are trying to contain Trump. Just don't do anything stupid. Don't threaten war with North Korea. As long as they can keep Trump roped in, then they can proceed. But if he goes off the wall on social media or in a speech, we're back to that question of uncertainty and unpredictability, whatever you have in a supposed national security strategy.
Gentlemen, I want to talk about legacy as well. I know it's a very cliched sort of term, but every president's legacy does get discussed at some point. Inderjeet, if I start with you, be it another 3 years from now, if that's all Donald Trump has left in office, or be it another 7 years, which he could potentially have, how difficult or how big an issue is it going to be to sort of, if the next president wants to, undo some of this? Because this all is major stuff and going back on agreements, these are the ones I pointed out before, which the US had committed itself to.
I don't see a fundamental break with the past, and I don't think, therefore, that the sort of nuances or small changes which President Trump has trumpeted will necessarily be that difficult. My big problem, I think, really, is the degree to which the Trump administration, with this greater level of militarism and greater level of hard economic power, I think is going to make the world a bit more of a dangerous place, and therefore effectively threaten peace. I think that's the big thing. And if that sort of rhetoric and the policies behind it to increase military spending, to put far more sort of military installations and boost the military, as he says they should be military, the US military should overmatch any competitor, such that the sons and daughters of America never have to have a fair fight with anyone. If that carries on, I think there is a threat to peace. And I think that is the biggest problem. That you cannot undo very easily at all. And I think he's ramping up the military kind of tensions much more than his predecessors. But I think had Hillary Clinton won in 2016, I'm not sure that she would have done anything very, very differently. Maybe the rhetoric would have been different. But I think the ramping up of American military power, which the people were very critical of Obama for, I think that would have carried on.
Scott Lucas, Indrajit's argument is interesting, and I've been interested to hear him repeatedly saying this, that he doesn't feel all the things we're talking about are actually a major a departure from previous US policy. If that's the case, then are we maybe overstating all of this? And again, as I said, when we come to legacy and all that, maybe it isn't that much of a change.
No, I have to disagree with my friend Indrajit here. I think in substance, I agree with some of what he says, and that is that the question of U.S. power, whether it be military or economic or political, that's an ongoing question. But I think there's two major differences here. One is that the United States is in a much different position than it was 10, 20 years ago. It doesn't call the shots. Indeed, I think in areas like the Middle East, the U.S. isn't even the central power in play. Might be a Russia, might be an Iran, might be a Saudi Arabia, for example. But here's the big distinction I would make, and that is that Donald Trump personally, and he can take credit for this, has really damaged American credibility in the eyes of so many people around the world. He's damaged it in part because of his policies, and Oliver actually was endorsing these earlier, anti-immigration policies, the Muslim ban, for example. He's damaged them through unpredictable statements, chaotic statements, threatening military action. And it's no secret, or it's no surprise that the national security strategy doesn't really talk about American soft power that much, because Donald Trump has really torn apart that very important notion of soft power. And here's the irony. Because Trump is so unpredictable, unreliable, many other countries will use their soft power. China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa, the European Union, to say, you can't count on Washington anymore. You got to look at us. We got to work together, not with Washington necessarily, but despite Washington, because of that guy in the White House.
Oliver, Indrajit and Scott are at opposing ends of the spectrum, pretty much. So where do you sit there on this argument?
I think this strategy, like all of Donald Trump's strategies right now, is about moving America from values to storytelling and ultimately into wealth. This is about democracy, markets, communications and technology, liberty, efficiency, communities, and equality. Those are 8 values that everyone can get behind. And this is the current thread that is going through the national security strategy, going through the infrastructure policy strategy, going through the economic policy strategy, and ultimately the science and technology strategies you'll be seeing coming forward with Donald Trump. If you shape America's storytelling around its core values, which is America first right now, then that is a break from the past. It's essentially basically moving away from necessarily Joseph Nye at Harvard's hard power, soft power, and moving into a much higher level of thinking on looking at values of storytelling. Why? Because if we don't tell our story across the world, then how can we basically match up against the regional powers that are emerging, that are cooperating and competing with us? We have to be able to tell America's story, because Donald because ultimately Reagan was the great communicator. Donald Trump is the media innovator. And so he has to use the new innovations in media to be able to tell those stories very
Oliver
properly.
McGee, Scott Lucas, Indrajit Palmer, we're all out of time. But I thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us for Inside Story. And as ever, thank you for joining us as well. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. You can head online for more discussion as well at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. On Twitter as well, join the conversation. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Kamal AJE. From the whole team here in Doha, thanks for joining us. See you again soon.